The League, of course, has a position on housing. It comes under our land use for the state. The League supports development of a comprehensive land use policy for Illinois that provides for orderly growth with preserving the environment, conserving natural resources, and providing needed open space. The state should identify, plan for, and have final authority over key and critical areas within the state. At every stage, there should be citizen input. The state should plan for adequate supplies of low and moderate income housing with every community providing a percentage under some kind of fair share plan. Now, this is our, this is our position. And of course, it means there's a goal to be met. The League favors regional planning agencies with mandatory and continuous funding from local, regional, and state sources. The League supports state enabling legislation for development impact fees. So, of course, there were some rather, headline-producing activities this fall with housing plan to come down, people without housing. And so a number of League members who unfortunately couldn't even be here today said, we got to have a meeting. So these three people very graciously agreed to come and help us understand some of this. The three of them will speak, and then there will be an opportunity for questions both in the session and to talk to them afterwards. And we all know how to get them, and if you don't, I've got their emails. So obviously, I should say I'm Debbie Rugg, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our program today, Issues of Affordable Housing in Champaign County. I'd like to introduce the members of the panel who will be sharing their expertise on aspects of this topic. Each of them will have 15, 18 minutes for a presentation, and they've asked me to signal them when they get toward the end of 5 minutes. You know how hard it is when you're talking and you almost get done. So we'll help them move through. They can interrupt each other if they want to, or say, gee, I want to cover this topic because she didn't or he didn't. Our first panelist is Darlene Kleppel. She's the Community Service Director for Champaign County Regional Planning Commission and has been in that position for about 13 years. She holds 2 master's degrees from Georgia Tech, one in architecture and one in city planning, and a master's, and in city planning, and a master's in social work from the University of Iowa. Tanya Crowley joined the Housing Authority of Champaign County as Director of Housing Choice Voucher Program last June. Prior to joining the HACC, she was a supervisor of the housing choice at the Atlanta Housing Authority in Atlanta, Georgia, where she was involved in the administration of almost 10,000 housing choice vouchers at the Atlanta Housing Authority. I think she brought the warm weather up with her. Our third panelist, John Rosca, is a staff attorney at the Land of Lincoln Legal Assistance Foundation. He's been in this position since 1983, concentrating on landlord-tenant issues and consumer law. He was trained in law at the University of Michigan. So, take it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you.
Darlene.
I would like to just welcome you all here today. This is an important issue in our community, and I'm glad that there's so much interest in this.
Stand up.
I'm sorry. You want me to stand up? Can you not hear the? Can you hear the microphone?
Oh.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay, it just was turned the wrong way, I guess. I would like to welcome you all here today, and I'm glad there's so much interest in this topic. It is a very important topic in our community. I work with the Champaign County Regional Planning Commission. We do many kinds of programs related to housing, and we also work a lot with low-income persons in the community and various at-risk populations. And so housing comes up a lot with our case managers and our planning staff. What I wanted to talk about today is just to talk a little bit about what subsidized housing is. I've given each of you a handout. For most of you, it's probably a yellow sheet of paper, 2-sided. And I want to talk about the definition of subsidized housing. For those of you that are there are some in the audience I know that are very familiar with this. This will be a little bit of a review, but I want to talk about it because not everyone realizes that there's so many different kinds of subsidized housing. The first kind of subsidized housing is what's called project-based subsidies, and that means that some amount of public money is given to a developer or an owner of a property so that they can provide housing at a reduced rent to the people that will be in the property to rent it later. Public housing is one of those, the Housing Authority being the primary example of that the Housing Authority builds projects that then either can offer free housing or very low rent housing to people because the subsidy was given to the Housing Authority to build the property. The second one would be project-based rental assistance, and one example of that would be even here in Urbana. There's an Urbana transitional housing program, and the city owns those properties, and so they're able to offer them at lower rents to the people that are in those properties. There's also supportive housing projects in our community. You might be familiar with the Inman or those kinds of things. Those are properties that were given money when they were put under construction or when they became operated by a certain owner. Money was put into the facility for the construction or the rehabilitation of that property. And so again, they're able to offer that at a reduced rent then to the residents because they're not trying to recover costs. There could be things like group homes. Community Elements owns group home buildings or subsidized apartments. The same thing has happened. The federal government or the state government has put in money into the housing development to build the apartment building, and so they are able then to offer that at a reduced rate to their residents that rent property there. And then private developments, which people often do not think about. Many private developers seek tax money to subsidize their housing developments. And we often think of subsidized housing as just for very low-income people. That's not the case. There are many housing developments for market rate housing or for luxury housing that also receive tax benefits in some way through tax credits or through incentives that the local governments may offer them in terms of building the roads or the utilities into the property, those kinds of things. And those are public subsidies, which then reduces the cost of actually owning the property for the people who buy the homes later. There are also something called tenant-based subsidies, and that's not related to the property itself. Those kinds of subsidies go with the person who is usually a low-income person or because they're a specific population, for example, a veteran or something like that. Those subsidies follow the person even if they move from property to property. There's not a rule, for example, where the public housing Section 8 vouchers or housing choice vouchers need to be located. They offer those as an incentive to the client to find an apartment that will be able to rent, but then that voucher helps pay part of the market rent. It goes with the client if they move. So if they transfer to another property, the voucher goes with them to reduce their rent. The same would be of what you may have heard of the TBRA or tenant-based rent assistance programs. There are several in our community operated by some nonprofit organizations. Those are programs that offer, based on the person's income, up or down, the tenant-based rent assistance helps to subsidize what the rent is for the property that they are in. And it's not tied necessarily to the property itself, it's tied to the tenant's circumstances. And then there's tenant-based supportive housing vouchers. Those are specifically offered in our community for people that have disabilities of various kinds. And by that I mean permanent disability, so it would be a mental health disability or a substance abuse disability, sometimes people with AIDS or sometimes people with developmental disabilities. And those are, again, it's because of the condition and the income of the person receiving the subsidy that those vouchers are given, not because of the property itself. And then there's mortgage subsidies, which many of you, might not think of this as a subsidy because you don't think about it that way, but if you've ever had a loan through the Fannie Mae Loan Corporation, which you've heard a lot about in the news lately, or perhaps you got a veteran's loan when you came back from one of the wars or one of your children came back from the wars, they're entitled to a veteran's loan product which reduces the amount of interest that they have to pay on loans. Those are subsidies granted because of certain people's circumstances, either their income or a certain kind of status, that entitles them to get below market rate loan products. And those are subsidies that are subsidized by your tax dollars. So for a lot of reasons, subsidies are for all different incomes, all different kinds of folks, depending on their circumstances, but often we just think about it in terms of just we might just only think about it in terms of one or two of those. So I just wanted to be broad about what we were talking about. Today I think we're focusing more on what's called affordable housing, which would be, in general, again, mostly thought about for people that are fairly low income. And I can talk about the definition of affordable housing is usually that the housing costs of the person are not more than 2/3 of their income. And so by housing costs, we would mean the cost of their mortgage or their rent, the cost of their utilities, and the cost of their insurance for their home. And those three items usually should not be more than 2/3 of a person's or a household's income in order to be considered an affordable dwelling in our culture, in our society. That's the definition that's normally used. Issues that come up often with clients that we're serving at our agency that have to do with relationship to housing and whether housing is truly affordable, even with that standard, has to do with things that are outside of the housing itself. It might have to do with the housing's location. So for example, a barrier could be that the house is located outside of public transportation routes, which means that in terms of a total working budget for that household, they're paying actually more than someone who lives on the bus route for the housing, where the housing is located, because they're also having then to include extra transportation costs. It's not really a housing cost, but it's related to where their housing is located. They wouldn't have it if their house wasn't there. Potentially other things might impact that, such as community services. How far is it to the school? Whether the kids that are going to school can get on the bus, again, public transportation. Whether there's parks nearby, other kinds of amenities like libraries. If you're a very low-income person and you can't afford internet and a home computer, you need to use the library. So the library is a good resource for you. So just those kinds of things are things that impact a total budget that has to do with whether your housing is actually affordable or not. The other big one that comes up often is employment opportunities. And as you know, many of you might have in your past history moved somewhere for your job. And that affected your housing costs, up or down, based on the community that you got your job in. And that's true of people of all income levels. So if there's employment opportunities, sometimes that affects the housing costs in that area. It affects what you have to pay for housing in that area. So it affects whether your housing is actually affordable. And I know that all of us do that calculation privately with our own families about, should I move to California where the housing costs are skyrocketing at this point, much higher than they are in the Midwest, for example? Is an increase in salary actually going to be of benefit to my family in the long run in terms of budgeting if I also have to pay much higher commensurate costs in my housing? So you go back to that calculation. Is it really working in your budget? And maybe housing in one area is actually very much more affordable in that sense than housing in another area. And then the other thing which helps sometimes with the budgeting questions have to do with what other public benefits a person might be entitled to. And those can help with the total budget. If, for example, a person is below the poverty level or below the median family income, which is much higher, they might be eligible for certain kinds of public benefits such as LIHEAP or Medicaid or Medicare or those kinds of things, and that would help either increase their income or reduce their expenses so that the housing costs might be able to be fit into the budget at a little bit higher rate. And then the other thing just to consider is whether or not, obviously if you're a person that's not making very much money, 2/3 of your housing costs might mean that you have very, very little money left to pay for anything else. And if you make a lot more money, maybe 2/3 of the housing, you still would have quite a bit of discretionary income to do other things with. One of the things I did want to mention, and I offered for your just entertainment later, is on the back side of this sheet there is a budget. I've given you a couple of numbers to work with. Assuming that your monthly income, you're making $9 an hour, which is a little bit above minimum wage in our community. You're working 40 hours a week and 4 weeks a month. This is your monthly income, $1,440. And of that, if you look at the bottom, 2/3 to be affordable, the housing items, the first 3 items on the list, must total less than $950, which leaves $490 that you can spend for other things. And the market rate for a 2-bedroom apartment in Champaign County is $802 a month. That's the market, that's fair market rate, which is considered a fair rent in our community, established by the federal government. So if you look at that, you can take a look at all these budget items and just do this in your own time sometime. Think about where, if you were making that much, you would actually spend your money. If you had this much money to spend, and these were the items you had to spend it on, how would you actually do a monthly budget that would get you by for the month? And on that note, I will reintroduce Tanya Crowley, who is the Housing Choice Voucher Manager at the Housing Authority, and she'll talk a little bit about their programs.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today. What I was asked to do is basically explain what is the Housing Choice Voucher Program and how families get to be on the program. Basically, what the Housing Choice Voucher Program is, it's a program sponsored by the federal government for assisting very low-income families, elderly, as well as disabled families to afford decent, safe, and sanitary homes. What happens is, how you get on the program. Most housing authorities have a wait list, and when their wait list is open, families get to apply. Once they apply, some wait lists, they do a lottery and they assign lottery numbers, or other wait lists may do basically as they're received, you go on the list. When vouchers become available, they start pulling from that voucher list. And what they do is, when we first take the application, we don't run any background checks or anything. But when vouchers become available, we start pulling the families in the order that they are on the list and running the eligibility requirements, such as criminal background screenings, verifying income, family composition, and things like that. Based on those results, if they pass through all those criteria, they're issued a voucher and they're invited to come in for a briefing, what we refer to as a briefing, where we basically go through all the criteria of being on the program, what the family's obligations are on the program, because the families do have responsibilities by participating in this program and accepting the subsidy. We explain to the participants that the role of the housing authority is to only pay a subsidy of the rent. So we only pay part of their rent. If they're zero income or disabled, some people we may pay all, but most people do pay a portion of their rent. The actual lease agreement is actually between the landlord and the tenant, not the housing authority. The housing authority enters into a separate contract with the landlord, which we call a housing assistance payment contract. And what we do is we'll pay that amount to the landlord on the participant's behalf. The participant is still responsible for the same responsibilities that you and I are as renters, homeowners, and things like that. They have to take care of their utilities, they have to manage their household budget, they have to make sure they pay their utility bills. Actually, paying utility bills is one of their family obligations. They have to make sure that their utilities remain on at all times. The program at Housing Authority of Champaign County, in October of 2010, Housing Authority of Champaign County became a Moving to Work agency. Under the Moving to Work designation, Champaign County joined about 40 other housing authorities, which gave them the designation to design the program to service the community that they serve. And some of the changes that the Housing Authority of Champaign County initiated are the same as the housing authority that I came from, which is Atlanta. And basically, we're starting to implement work requirements, school requirements, training requirements. Effective November 1st, we initiate our local self-sufficiency requirement, which requires every household member 18 years or older to be actively doing something. They have to at least work 20 hours a week, attend school, or be a part of a training program. So we're starting to engage our families to take an active role in becoming self-sufficient, with the goal of going from subsidized to non-subsidized housing, which I like to call graduating from the program, because I think that's something to be proud of. When you transition from a place where you had to get assistance to take care of yourself to becoming self-sufficient and you can now do it your own, I think that's worth graduating and celebrating. So what we actually are doing now are starting to have meetings with our families where we're helping them to set up plans for their household. What is the goal? Do you want to buy a house? Do you want to finish a degree? What is the ultimate goal? And then what we're asking them to do is build a plan, and each year when it comes time for their annual recertification, what we're going to do is review the plan and see if they are starting to make progress within that plan. The plan currently, right now, is outlined for about a 6-year process. So over 6 years of the recertification process, we're going to continue to revisit those plans. We're going to continue to engage our families, but along the way, we're going to work with the community to try to find programs that will help them reach those goals. Schools, financial advisors, fixing your credit. What a lot of families don't realize, and a lot of people don't realize, is that our families are able to also utilize their voucher to buy homes. We have a home ownership program. Right now, we have about 8 families in Champaign County who are purchasing their homes through the Housing Authority. We're hoping to grow that program this year and open it back up. Right now, it's on hold to be restructured. And hopefully the housing market will get better so they can get out and buy homes. But one of my primary objectives in the next few months is to continue to network with the community and find programs where we can at least get them started on fixing their credit, setting up household budgets, and preparing to become homeowners. Because a lot of people don't realize that's actually a process. That's not something a lot of people jump up and say, oh, today I'm going to go buy a house like I got up yesterday and bought a pair of shoes. It doesn't work that way. So we want to really start teaching our families and getting them in contact with people who can help them reach those goals that they're planning for their families. We also have an education program for high school, for juniors and seniors in the community, where they come in. We have an intern who works with them from the University of Illinois, and basically he takes them on college tours. He shows them how to search the internet for scholarships. He helps them apply. They do mock interviews and things like that for college interviews. Really great program, and that's been going on for a number of years and has been very successful at Champaign County. We also are redeveloping in the community. All of you, I'm sure many of you know, a lot of properties have come down, and we're in the process of getting ready to start new projects which are going to build new communities for families with new options for them. So the Housing Authority of Champaign County, we are really working diligently to service the families in Champaign County who are very low income, and we're growing. I was reviewing some reports. When Champaign County first became moving to work in October of 2010, they were servicing 1,244 tenant-based voucher families and 430 public housing families. As of the end of fiscal year, we're serving 444 public housing families and 1,425 tenant voucher families. So we are growing, and we are trying to engage more families. The thing that I think confuses people most is they think that the voucher is something that we have. The voucher is a term that has been used, but the vouchers really is just a monetary amount. And basically, we have to take the funding that HUD allots us and divide it across all the families that we service. So right now, of the 1,400 plus families that we're servicing, we have an average tenant payment of $148.79. So of the rental amount that Darlene described, averaging about $800, the tenants are paying about $148 themselves. We're paying the rest on their behalf. This year, the tenants have paid about $10,900 to landlords, whereas the Housing Authority has paid $10,500,000 plus for them. So we are working to help our families, support our families. Right now, I have about 6 families that will be graduating from the program over the course of 6 months. And what happens when they get to the point, what we consider graduating is when they're paying their full rent amount on their income. After they've sustained that for 6 continuous months, they're no longer in need of the program. According to HUD, after 180 days, if the Housing Authority has not made a payment on your behalf, you graduate from the program. So I'm excited for those 6 families. I hope they're equally excited. As well as right now, I have about 75 families that are interested in becoming homeowners. So as we open up the home ownership program and start to reach out to the community to get them the services that they need to be ready to apply for loans and locate homes, we're going to have about 70 families joining the home ownership market. So we're very excited about what's going on at the Housing Authority. That's what I have to present. I provided vouchers with more in-depth details. I think some are on the table. It also has our website link, as well as the hours of operation of the Housing Choice Voucher Department in the back of the packet. So at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. John Rosca, the staff attorney at Land O' Lincoln.
Thank you. Yeah, I work at Land O' Lincoln Legal Assistance. I've been there since 1983 and since 1987 here in Champaign. I guess I do the weekly column, the Q&A column in the News Gazette, so if you're a scrupulous reader on the Sunday paper, you might have read the column there. I'm going to kind of go back and forth with and cover a lot of the things that have been previously covered by the previous speakers. I guess it's, and I apologize for the patchwork nature of that, but it kind of reflects the patchwork nature of subsidized housing. And I guess I should thank the League of Women Voters for inviting me. When Shirley asked me, I automatically accepted because Shirley's okay in my book, and whatever she wants I'll do. I'm sorry she can't be here, but I know she's enjoying herself down in Texas. So I was going to give kind of an overview, somewhat like Darlene did, of public and subsidized housing to kind of give a little tutorial of that. And I'm going to concentrate exclusively on landlord-tenant stuff. I'm not going to talk about home ownership. That's a completely different subject. I don't do a whole lot of that. Other lawyers in our office do. I concentrate on landlord-tenant stuff. So the basic difference that subsidized housing creates, when we're talking about affordable housing, we're essentially talking about some kind of government housing. Because the government involvement, the government money is what makes it affordable. And so there's basically three sources of government money possible in subsidized housing. And again, this is federal housing. I know that Darlene talked about some city money, there's some state money, but mostly what we're talking about is federal government subsidies that make housing affordable. The primary one is HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, the federal monies that provide subsidies to housing authorities, subsidies to private owners, and subsidies for the Section 8 program that the Housing Authority described. As part of the patchwork, there's also what used to be called Farmers Home Administration housing, which is actually administered by the Department of Agriculture. I guess they stopped calling it Farmers Home Administration housing back in 1993, but I still call it that. I guess now it's called Rural Development Housing or Rural Housing Development. It is a government federal subsidy that is designed for housing in rural areas. So outside of Champaign, outside of Urbana, you will see government subsidized projects like in Tolono, St. Joseph. I think Sydney's got one. Same kind of programs, but and much like the HUD programs, except the money's coming from the Department of Agriculture. And then more recently, the real source of subsidies, and the trend is to do it through tax incentives, low-income housing tax credits, which then is administered or coming through the IRS. So the IRS is in the subsidized housing business. And low-income housing tax credits are really kind of the trend now of providing affordable housing by providing tax credits to developers when they build and develop housing for low-income people. Now, there's this patchwork of all sorts of different programs, and HUD has a whole menu of different programs that can get very bewildering. And so I guess I try to give a little overview of that just to give some idea of the different things so you may be able to keep them straight. The classic view of public housing is like the projects, which used to be Bradley McKinley, I guess Dunbar Courts now, but I guess also included in that would be Skelton Place, Steer Place, senior citizen housing. That is public housing owned by the Public Housing Authority, and so they are the landlord and they operate it, they own and operate it. So that's the kind of classic old school model that is more and more becoming an endangered species. I mean, affordable housing and government subsidies for housing overall is becoming an endangered species. There's less and less funding and more restrictions, and so, but public housing most definitely is an endangered species. They're not building any more of it, and they're converting more and more of it, replacing more and more of it with some kind of public-private hybrid, as we see in Champaign-Urbana with like Crystal Lake townhouses and the Mansion Square Parkside redevelopment. That's a public-private ownership kind of hybrid. So the classic model of the projects where it's the Champaign Housing Authority that's owns and operates it and is the landlord, that's the old model, that's one model. And in public housing, the tenant's rent is based on their income. It's 30% of their adjusted gross income. So when you live in public housing, your rent is based on your income. which is a very important factor because, as Darlene described, if you're trying to live and make your housing affordable, it's very difficult to do without some kind of a rent subsidy. And that kind of illustrates one of the distinctions in subsidized housing. There are subsidies that help pay the tenant's rent, and there are subsidies that help the developer build and develop property. And so the development subsidies are probably the most, in dollar-wise, the biggest part of our subsidized housing programs. And those are, you know, the subsidy goes to help reduce the interest rate on the construction loan, on the acquisition of the property. Now with the low-income housing tax credit, I don't understand exactly how it works, but I guess there's these valuable tax credits that businessmen can get that provide a huge tax benefit for different people who invest in those things. And they're very competitive and very, it's a precious commodity that developers like to get. But that kind of subsidy that simply subsidizes the construction and development of housing doesn't necessarily result in affordable rents. They're lower rents than the market rates, and part of the restrictions on the subsidy is that they have to market them to low-income people with various restrictions. But the rents themselves are not necessarily subsidized. An example of that, I guess, is Prairie Green Apartments in Urbana. I guess there's Prairie Green 1, 2, and 3 now, where I think it's low-income housing tax credits has developed that. They're marketed for low-income people, and I guess there's different varieties of low-income, very low-income, low-income. There's different definitions of those that the developers are required to market. And then the rents are set slightly less, or at less than market rents. That's part of the restrictions, that in exchange for getting the subsidy, the government money, the government benefit, they have to make some concessions by making them affordable. But the development subsidies only subsidize the development. They don't subsidize the rents. So in addition to that, there are programs that do subsidize the rent. And that, as Darlene was saying, that they can be project-based, where they belong to a project, like Country Brook Apartments in Champaign. The rents there are subsidized. So it's, again, the same 30% of your adjusted gross income, just as if you were living in public housing. The rent is the same. So it is affordable rents because the Country Brook gets a subsidy that helps pay the tenant rents. Then the last kind, and I guess the newer kind in things that people may have heard about, is the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is a voucher or a subsidy that subsidizes the individual's tenant's rent. I like to think of it kind of like a housing stamp. Like food stamps, you can take your food stamps. It used to be an actual paper stamp that you took and you exchanged it at different merchants that were willing to accept food stamps, and you could only buy food with it. A housing choice voucher is kind of the same idea, that if you get it, it is a voucher that you can go out and you can buy housing with. You can pay your apartment with. If you find a landlord that will accept it, then you have, they accept the subsidy that comes with it, and like all the other subsidized rents, your rent under the Housing Choice Voucher Program is 30% of your adjusted gross income. Now, what makes the voucher a particularly precious commodity is that they're limited. And I guess that's one thing about affordable housing and subsidized rents that's different from other public benefit programs. Housing is not an entitlement. Unlike food stamps, if you apply for food stamps and you qualify for food stamps because of the non-monetary issues and the monetary issues, you get food stamps. But housing is very different. You can apply for housing, you can qualify for housing, but because of the limited supply, you don't get it. You may go on a waiting list, you may not get it. It is not an entitlement that being categorically eligible means that you actually get it. So the scarcity of of subsidized housing, and in particular the scarcity of the housing choice voucher, is what really makes it a precious commodity. And that's why low-income people really like the housing choice voucher and really want it. But as being described before, it's hard to get, because just to apply for a housing choice voucher, the applications are usually closed. Maybe 2 weeks every year, maybe less than that, is this narrow window of opportunity that you can just go and fill out an application. Otherwise, if you want to apply, they won't take your application. So it's only during very restricted periods of time that you can even apply. Then you go on the waiting list, and then if you are eligible, and as vouchers become available, as people go off the program, or maybe the Housing Authority gets more, then they're issued. But again, as was described before, the initial screening to get you on the waiting list, you may find out once you're ready to actually maybe get a voucher that now you're no longer eligible. And so just the fact that you got on the waiting list doesn't mean that you're going to get a voucher, because additional screening can screen you out. But then if you do get a voucher, what happens then is the Housing Authority gives you a voucher. And there actually is a piece of paper. You don't actually go around and show it to the landlord, but there is a piece of paper that says this is your voucher. But once you have a voucher, then you have, I think it's 90 or 120 days, or that period of time can be extended, to go out and find a landlord who will take it. And so it is up to you. And you have to do it within the Champaign Housing Authority area, at least for the first year. So you have to go out and find a landlord. Now, and that's not always easy. Urbana has an ordinance that prohibits discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. So a landlord in Urbana cannot refuse to take a Section 8 voucher. They can't say, no, I'm sorry, we just don't do that. Champaign is the other way. They don't have any protections that specifically protect housing Section 8 voucher holders. So a landlord in Champaign can say, no, we don't do Section 8, sorry. And that, I know from painful experience, that is legal. I've challenged it in Champaign, and the judge said, Champaign wants to make it mandatory, they can do what Urbana did and have a specific ordinance that says no discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders. So once you get your voucher, it's not an easy job of finding a landlord that will take it. And truth be told, there are some predatory landlords who like the Section 8 program because they like that gravy train from the housing, and they don't do a whole lot to maintain their properties, and they kind of exploit the program. But that's a whole other story. So anyhow, so you find a landlord who is willing to rent to you, and then that landlord has to get approved by the Housing Authority, and their place has to be inspected. It has to pass what's called the HQS, the Housing Quality Standards. So the Housing Authority sends an inspector out to inspect it. And then the rents that the landlord wants to charge have to be within the ranges that the Housing Authority approves. And so if all that goes well, then there is this three-cornered relationship between there's the landlord and tenant, they sign a lease, and then there's a contract between the landlord and the Housing Authority that pays the rent. And as I said, it's 30% of the adjusted gross income, and it's not unusual for the tenant payment to be minimal or nothing, zero. I have many people who have zero income or very low income. Their rent is zero, and I guess technically they actually get somewhat of a subsidy from the Housing Authority, because if your rent's zero, if your income's zero, there's a utility allowance, and it actually can make it, we sometimes used to call them negative renters. So the Housing Authority pays like $20, $30 a month to the utility companies, and the tenant pays zero, and the Housing Authority pays the rest. Yes, okay. The thing about the Section 8 program, with the voucher program, it's up to the landlord to screen the tenant. Housing Authority doesn't have any say in that. They issue the voucher, but they don't say to the landlord, they don't have anything to do with screening the tenant by that the landlord does. So it's up to the landlord to rent. It's up to the landlord to decide whether the tenant is behaving themselves. It's up to the landlord to evict. It's not the housing authority's call, because the landlord-tenant relationship, the housing authority pretty much stays out of. So if a landlord wants to evict a housing choice voucher, they can do it. They can tell the housing authority. But the simple fact that a tenant might be evicted, or the eviction process may be started against a housing choice voucher tenant, that means that the landlord wants them to go and they may end up moving. It does not automatically mean that they lose their voucher, because again, the voucher is between the housing authority and the tenant, and the fact that the landlord wants the tenant to go doesn't necessarily mean that the tenant loses their voucher. Now, in practice, it happens that way a lot, but it's not automatic. If the landlord wants the tenant to go, the tenant, it is possible for the tenant to ask the housing authority for a transfer, take their voucher, and go somewhere else and find another landlord that will rent to them. And so they can hang on to their voucher that way. One of the important things that makes a voucher valuable is its portability. You can take it anywhere in the community, and eventually you can take it anywhere in the country. Usually there's restrictions on the first year or so. You have to use it for the first year in Champaign, but after that you can take it somewhere else. I know I have people moving to Indianapolis, other places all the time with their vouchers. And again, there's different ways that it gets absorbed by the housing authority there, or it still gets administered here. But that portability, that nationwide portability, is again another factor that makes the housing choice voucher an incredibly precious commodity that people really want. Oh, so I see my time's up, so I'll go ahead and stop now.
Well, we, I think, probably rushed each of you, and I think each of you were pretty efficient in presenting. But because of that, it's only quarter two, and therefore you may have each thought of something that, boy, I wish I'd said that, or want some clarification. So if you each would like to take a few minutes to do that a piece, and then we'll get to questions, okay? Darlene,
Sure.
it's yours.
Well, I did want to mention real briefly a couple of the programs that we operate at the Regional Planning Commission. We do have an emergency rent assistance program, which does help people. It is not a voucher. It is not a routine kind of assistance that you can give people who simply can't pay their rents. But it is for emergency situations, so it does help sometimes for people to be able to stay housed when otherwise they might be evicted for an extraordinary expenses one month, or if somebody in the family, a divorce, or somebody moves away, or there's just changes in income, things like that. It's very limited amount of money. As John was mentioning, many of these programs that are funded, there's often many more people that would qualify for them or would seek that kind of assistance than there is funding available for housing related things. The LIHEAP program also helps people with housing expenses, and often when my case managers work with folks, what they talk to them about is rearranging the things in their budget. So potentially, if they can find a way to, if they're eligible for LIHEAP benefits and are able to get a payment toward their utilities that month, it might help that they would be able then better. LIHEAP? LIHEAP stands for Low Income Heating Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP. Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. And we serve in this county about 6,000 people a year. Other kinds of programs that are available in the community that we refer people to quite a bit if they're having difficulty making a monthly budget work are the food pantries. And I know you've read in the paper and other places the food pantries are getting busier and busier because people are using that as a way to reduce their food expenses so that then they can pay their shelter expenses. Just all kinds of things like that. So those are the main issues that come up with the program people that we see. Do you want to say okay?
Some things I wanted to mention. Under our Moving to Work designation, we basically advise HUD of the activities that we plan to initiate for the community. Effective January 1st, 2012, Housing Authority of Champaign County started calculations of flat rent on new admissions. So basically, any families that ported into Champaign County after January 1st, 2012, 12, their rent was calculated on a flat rent method, whereas our normal calculation, we include a utility allowance, a dependent allowance. Under flat rent, those two allowances go away, and it's solely based on their income versus the payment standard. And effective January 1st, 2013, those calculations start applying to our existing families. So as our families are starting to recertify effective January 1st, 2013, they're starting to take a larger responsibility for their rent. So come end of this time next year when we're reporting our fiscal figures, that 148 figure will be higher because the families are now going to be taking a larger responsibility for their rent. And I just want to touch on something that Mr. Roscoe mentioned. As far as eviction, he is absolutely correct. Eviction does not automatically mean that a participant loses their voucher. Under our current policy, the only time a participant will lose their voucher through eviction is if the eviction is court-ordered or the landlord receives a court-ordered money judgment. Under those two criteria, those would cause a participant to lose their voucher. So I just want to touch on those points.
Well, I guess one observation, one comment. The patchwork nature of the affordable housing makes it really difficult for people to find it because there's not one place you can go to find all the affordable housing in Champaign County. Where I work, I always try to kind of keep a list of subsidized government housing, and it's impossible to really compile that. I mean, I have what I think is a pretty complete list, but I'm always finding out about other things because, again, some of it's administered by Farmers Home Administration, some of it's by HUD, some of it's by other stuff, and I guess there's these individual programs within the different cities provide. So it's not easy to go and find because you can't just go to one place. You have to know about the different places where it exists to be able to get it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I imagine people have questions. This isn't the time for comments or editorials, but it is time for questions, and I'm going to ask that whoever's answering the question would repeat the question so that it gets picked up so the TV people can, we can hear it on TV. So does anybody have questions? Okay, let's start here.
Okay, if the voucher system is closed here in town, can I go to another city in Illinois and get a voucher and then bring it back here?
You can, but it would be.
You want to repeat the question?
I'm sorry. If the question was, if the voucher program the wait list is closed in Champaign County, can you apply someplace else? You can apply in other areas if their wait list is open. A lot of housing authorities still have the 1-year requirement that you remain in their community the first year.
Okay, thank you.
And back here, Esther.
It's hard, well, I was hoping that you would address the housing problem we have in Champaign County, and this is a good primer for people who don't know anything about this. I'm just wondering if all three of you would address the population that you really haven't addressed, and that's the extremely low-income people. We can throw around the terms low-income and very low-income. The extremely low-income, who make up about 20% of the population of Champaign County, have incomes below 30% of area median, family income approximately, income below $20,000 a year. And almost all housing programs funded by federal, state, and local governments in our community are targeted to households, low-income households whose incomes are well over $20,000 a year, which is why we have so many homeless children in Champaign County all the time. And I'm just wondering if you can address how the mom with 2 kids who makes $14.40 a month pays over close to $150 of payroll tax and can afford $950 a month rent and then feed her children, pay for childcare, transportation, et cetera, on the balance of the $332.
So if we could take maybe 5 minutes, and I know that you guys weren't originally asked to do that because we did need a primer. But since some of that questions originally was brought up, would you be able to
Sure.
address some of that?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit, and that's many of the clients that we see at our office. It's a very difficult situation, and it's not just in Champaign County, it's across the nation that affordable housing is an issue for that reason. There are people who whose incomes are just, as you can see, if you make minimum wage, you're never going to be able to afford an apartment probably in this community. The difficulty really revolves around trying to provide supportive services for those families, and other kinds of policies make a difference. For example, if you're a single person with a small child, probably in order to make your housing payment for a one-room apartment or a two-room apartment, you're going to need to work not only one job but two jobs, but you still have to worry about child care. And so then the child care policy becomes an issue of how much does child care subsidy pay. So that goes into the community services that are other kinds. It's really talking about a total budget for folks. What kinds of resources can subsidize not only the housing part, but every other thing that might impact that family so that they can get by. You may or may not be aware that there are lots of apartments in our community that are really built primarily with students in mind. I'm sure that's not a surprise to anyone. They're pretty much luxury apartments with 3 and 4 bedrooms. And each person that's renting, a student, basically gets a bedroom. Though it was really difficult to find properties like that for families because the rents are very high. They're counting on 3 or 4 students each purchasing a room, as opposed to a family purchasing a large unit with 3 bedrooms. And so while the university housing market is a very thriving business in our community, and that's great for our community economically, it also creates a hardship for families, particularly larger families who need 3 and 4 bedroom apartments that really can't afford those rents at all. I mean, they're just not competitive at all. And so those become difficult issues, and then you come into the other barriers that I mentioned earlier. The housing is usually a little bit cheaper as you move further out away from the city, but that's because public transportation is not available. Then people have to factor in their gas costs, which now, as you've known, have skyrocketed. So it becomes a real struggle for families that are trying to get out of poverty. About 5 years ago, my staff did a study because we were trying to see at what point people could move out of poverty into self-sufficiency, working their way up with getting more education, getting a better job, getting their income improved, getting a second job. And what we discovered is that you really need in our community to be able to make about $32,000 to $35,000 a year to be able to get off of all public benefits and support yourself.
And that's as a single person.
And that's that was a family of 4. So it could, but it could be one. It could be 1 breadwinner or 2 breadwinners, but it's that amount of money you need to support a family of 4. So, as you can see, a minimum wage doesn't come close to that. So, anyway, that may be helping. It's not saying I have a solution, but it's maybe giving some little more depth to the problem.
Of course, there's no easy answer to that question. The average family currently on the Housing Choice Voucher Program in Champaign County makes about $10,000. There's unfortunately always going to be more need than resources. What we're trying to do with our Moving to Work designation is restructure the program to get the families who currently are getting the subsidy to a point to where they'll graduate, which means that'll be money available to redistribute to people who are waiting to get the subsidy. And that is what we're hoping to be the effects of our local self-sufficiency program. As our families get the education and the training skills that they need to go out and acquire better paying jobs, they'll get to the point to where they're paying the full amount of their rent and essentially graduate from the program, and then we can pull families off the wait list and help those families accomplish the same types of goals. Unfortunately, is it going to be a quick thing? We all know it's not. We know it takes time to accomplish all of those milestones. But it's something that now we're strongly encouraging, and now is a part of the requirement to get the continued assistance under the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So that's what we're doing to try to help with the extremely low income families in this community.
Well, I think that the problem described is that the demand for affordable housing exceeds the supply. I guess there's 2 solutions to that. You increase the supply of affordable housing, or you increase the financial ability of the person so that they're not low income anymore. So those are the 2 direct solutions, but how you do that, I don't have that solution. I guess in the meantime, because I deal with people on an individual basis, is to understand the program so that they hang on to, if they are able to get this precious commodity, that they hang on to it and that they don't lose it because of something they did, or they don't lose it because of something the housing authority did.
Let's back here and then.
Okay, could you tell how much the waiting list has changed over time? Now versus 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
The question is how much the waiting list has changed over time. I'm not sure I understand what do you mean by the change.
Longer, shorter?
Well, in Champaign County, they're only maintaining a wait list of 400. The housing authority I came from had 5,000. Anytime a wait list opens, you never know exactly how many applications you get. So I'm assuming this wait list was set when I arrived in June. So I'm assuming Mr. Bland, one thing he explained to me when he hired me was he didn't want to have a wait list as large as Atlanta because, of course, 5,000 people, the chances of getting off that list are slim to none with the resources that are available. HUD is cutting funding every year almost, and over the last couple of rotations, they've actually taken money back. So right now, we're maintaining a pool of only 400 so that as soon as we do get additional funding, we have something that we can really offer versus putting 5,000, 10,000 people on a waiting list and their opportunity may never even come up.
Does that answer your question?
Well, it raises the real question of how many people need subsidized housing in Champaign County, and how has that changed over time?
Unfortunately, that's not a question I could ask being new to Champaign County. I know across the U.S., though, the needs of housing is great everywhere. There are families, I mean, just like Darlene was describing, minimum wage does not cover average rent, never has and never will. So the need is everywhere. It's not just Champaign County. So I'm sure Champaign has had the same challenges as Atlanta, as Florida, and any other area where the job markets have been so hardly hit, where families are losing their jobs, losing incomes, and they're losing the resources that otherwise sustain them. So the Housing Choice Program is not the cure-all. It never will be funded to be the cure-all. We all know that the government is under serious financial strains right now. So this program is also being impacted as well as many others.
Jane, you had a question?
I think Darlene mentioned, or maybe it's that if you move out in the county, your expenses might be lower, but then you have, has Chris, the new transportation program, like say if you move to Rantoul and now you have that transportation, has that had any effect on that at all?
Well, it certainly does help
Oh,
some.
repeat the
I'm
question.
sorry. The question was, there is a transportation program in our county called CHRIS, who provides some rural transportation, and it does help folks. Primarily, they've been helping folks that need to get into town for appointments. I don't think very many people use it for jobs, for example, on a 5-day-a-week basis.
I guess the other part of that was when I mentioned Rantoul, I think things are improving there too, but there might be housing out there, but I'm not sure if it's low enough
Right.
for them or not.
Right, and that goes back to wherever you would live, you would need to figure out, is there a job opportunity close by, or if they need to commute, is that worth the moving further out? It's always that calculation.
Yes.
Certain companies such as Amram have their Warm Neighbor program.
Yes.
How is that money distributed? People have to apply, or does it just go to Amram?
The money for Warm Neighbors or Dollar or More, those kinds of programs that the utility companies offer, and some of you may have contributed to through your utility bills, they offer the opportunity to check off a box. Those monies go into the Ameren account. That account is then separated among their service area, just like our LIHEAP funds are. And we have, in our county, we've received some of those funds, and then we are able to distribute them according to those program rules if people are eligible for those things.
Then it really does go to people who need it.
It is going back to people that need it, yes.
Thank you. Any other? Yes.
I just wanted to bring people's attention, some of you got the cover, or some covers of this journal, and you talk of this as a national problem, and the Planning Commissioner's Journal, News and Information for Citizen Planners, affordable housing matters. From last summer, actually, summer of 2011, a whole issue on affordable housing. And the reason that we had some top pages that disappeared quickly is that there is a website here, and there are communities who have faced this very successfully in getting the government locally to get into the housing affair.
So you're talking about groups that are not represented here. These are people trying to help the situation that we have here.
Something beyond.
So there is a website, and it's summer of 2011.
Right.
That's great.
Sorry.
Before you leave, I want to get back and thank you guys. But this meeting will be rebroadcast on Urbana Public Television, Comcast Cable Channel 6, on Sunday at 9:30 in the evening and Monday at 10:30 in the morning. Other times will come up, and if you go there, it'll tell you when it'll be on, and we'll be putting it out from the league. It is also will be made available on YouTube later today, because I know some of our members said, well, shouldn't it be on YouTube? So it is. At youtube.com/UPDB6. So that's really good. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope you could stay for just a half a minute in case some other people have questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you.